Back in January, we started this series looking together at Song of Songs under the title Lyrics of Love. I heard recently a story of a young woman in a university town who went into the town one day, bumped into a guy that she'd seen around the campus and knew a bit. They had some mutual friends and they got chatting and exchanged phone numbers. And then he sent her a message inviting her out. And she replied politely to say she wasn't able to do so at that time. But she didn't know why his friends were unhappy and a bit cold towards her over the next few days. And it turns out she'd fallen victim to the perils of predictive text. She thought she'd written, "Very sorry, I'm not free till the end of term." What she'd actually written was, "Very sorry, I'm not free to the end of time." Which is a very different message, and shows how dangerous miscommunication can be, particularly in matters of love, and particularly in sensitive areas like the Song of Songs. So, as some of you might recall, in our first few sessions, we began by asking the question, well, why Song of Songs? And I shared a few reasons with us: because it's in the Bible, because it's in the Old Testament, because it's poetry, and because it allows us to talk about sex, and especially because it allows us to talk about sex in celebratory mode. And what I mean by that is Song of Songs invites us, I think, to have a different conversation about sex than the one we often have in church, by celebrating the good gifts of love, romance, and sex to human beings from the hands of a loving God. Now, I think it's been expressed helpfully along these lines that there are three main ways to view sex. First of all, we can see sex as gross. Now, this might be because there's a temptation in some circles to focus almost entirely on what's forbidden, on what's sinful, but with very little teaching on how the Bible promotes a healthy perspective on human sexuality. Or it might be because of the influence of ancient Greek views, which impacted the church quite early on, and which actually continue to impact the church 2,000 years later. Greek views which essentially consider the body and its appetites and pleasures as evil at worst or second-rate at best. Certainly not something to which we want to give too much attention. Or it may be that for various reasons, people struggle with shame when it comes to sex, perhaps because of previous failings, or maybe if someone suffered abuse or assault of some sort. But there's one view that we probably recognize and are familiar with: sex as gross. A second view is sex as God. Now, what we mean by that is that we're familiar with this idea that what takes the ultimate place in our life, the thing that demands most allegiance, that takes ultimate priority, is effectively our God, what the Bible calls idolatry. And for some, sex can take this place. This has always been a temptation for human beings. Both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, God's people lived in a cultural environment where sex frequently became a god or took on God-like nature. And it's perhaps even a temptation in the cultural moment in which we find ourselves, where there is, as we will know, a spirit of individualism. Now, it would take much longer to explore this properly, but the spirit of our age can tend towards a view that at the end of the day, it's all about me. It's what sociologists technically call expressive individualism. That it's all about me being free to express myself as an individual. That, at the end of the day, is the bottom line of the culture in which we live. In other words, it's up to me to define myself. It's up to me to determine how I live. and no one dare question my decisions about who I am or how I live, especially when it comes to matters of sex. And that is, in some respects, the cultural context in which we live. And that in turn can mean that sex or sexual identity becomes effectively my God. Because it's about how we define ourselves and how we live, where our choices about sex or our choices about gender or our choices about anything else are about how we stay true to ourselves. But instead of seeing sex as gross or sex as God, Scripture, of course, invites us to see sex as gift. So from a biblical worldview or perspective, God created us, male and female, and uniquely and intentionally made us not only to seek relationship with each other, but designed our bodies for sex and for sexual pleasure, not just for procreation. Now, at one level, it shouldn't come as a surprise that a whole book of the Bible is devoted to this highly significant aspect of God's creation. And I've suggested to us in this series that there are good reasons for taking the Song of Songs as what it naturally appears to be, a collection of love poems which celebrate the beauty of romantic love and sexual desire between a man and a woman who, at least within the context of the biblical worldview, are drawn together in marriage. That's a little bit of a recap of the shaping of this whole series. So a few weeks back, we started looking at the opening of the book under the title Expressions of Desire in 1:1 to 2:7. And after the title, we very quickly hear from the woman about the goodness of sexual desire in verses 2 to 4. We've said that she's the principal singer in the poem. She's the dominant voice, and she expresses her desires very freely and very frankly. And that, again, is because the Bible is positive about marriage, positive about sex within marriage, and sexual desire is a good part of God's creation. And that led us into thinking about what we call the pursuit of real intimacy in verses 5 to 14 of chapter 1. So we see there this couple not only talking to each other and sharing their vulnerabilities with each other, but also affirming each other and delighting in each other. And that also comes out, we said, in the next section, chapter 1, verse 15 to chapter 2, verse 7, where we saw the delight of mutual affirmation. So in these verses, we saw the man and the woman exchange just very simple compliments, picking up on each other's words and reflecting them back to each other in a kind of mutual positive reinforcement. It's like a beautiful back and forth duet. So she'll say, I'm just a common or garden lily. And he responds by saying, no, you're like a lily among thorns. And she then says, well, you're like an apple tree in a forest that doesn't have any fruit trees at all. And I delight to sit in your shade, and your fruit is sweet to my taste, and so on. So there's this playful, flirtatious in many ways, banter back and forth between the man and the woman. It's beautifully affirming. And in this passage, it all seems to lead to a passionate clinch towards the end of the section, and the poem delicately draws down a blind at that point. Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and does of the field, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires. But passionate clinch aside, at one level, their mutual affirmation is basic relational stuff. Now, I didn't mention this last week, but I thought I'd do so this evening. Some of you might have heard of the 5-to-1 positivity ratio. This comes from the work of the psychologist, North American psychologist called John Gottman, who has done a ton of work on actually divorce prediction. He's an expert on divorce prediction and marital stability, basically through analyzing thousands of relationships over the years. And so he's responsible for this 5-to-1 positivity ratio. And this basically suggests that for every negative interaction, particularly during a conflict, a stable and happy relationship has 5 or more positive interactions, which, just to be clear, doesn't mean saying, I love you, 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 but it means that in a stable relationship can cope with disagreement and even some criticism, providing the positive to negative engagements outweigh one another by a ratio of about 5-to-1. Now, that's also generally true in other relationships, like those between parents and children and between friends. The same basic principle holds. Now, should it be a huge surprise that the Bible got there a couple of centuries before the Gottman Institute? So that was expressions of desire. Then last week, we turned to the next part of the book, what I called invitations to love in chapter 2, verse 8 to 3, verse 5. And again, a bit of recap from last week, especially for those of us who weren't able to be here. Because like we said, an enduring image in romantic poetry is the lover at the window or calling up to the balcony at the object of his affection. And normally it is the man who is calling up to the woman. And what this is a kind of, there's a seeking, but also a separation. And the seeking is about seeking to overcome the separation. And that's just such a common motif, universal motif, really, in love poetry. It's there in ancient Egypt, and it's here too in the Song of Songs. And it's there in many, many fairy tales, as well, as I'm sure you'll be aware. So the Song of Songs contains these twin themes of separation and seeking. And sometimes it's the man who seeks the woman, and sometimes it's the woman who seeks the man. And so in this section, we have separation and seeking. And this section I suggested to us last week contains 2 poems, what I called the daytime poem in chapter 2, verse 8 to 17, because it occurs in the daytime. It's, it's not complicated. And then there's the nighttime poem in chapter 3, verse 1 to 5, because you will have guessed it occurs in the nighttime. And then the daytime poem, although actually it's a woman who's saying the poetry, she's imagining the man speaking. So it's certainly the man who seeks. So in the daytime poem, the man seeks, and in the nighttime poem, it's the woman who searches for the man. And the daytime poem captures the longing for intimacy. The nighttime poem captures the pain of separation. And as I say, both of them appear to go together. So in the first poem, we hear the woman's excitement as she anticipates the arrival of the man. And she describes him, we saw last week, as a gazelle or a young stag. She pictures him bounding over the mountains as he comes to her. And as you'll see there in red on the screen, that language is used at the beginning of the poem and the end of the poem, which is a way of marking this out as a poem, as a unit in its own right. But then at the heart of this poem, we see a smaller unit enclosed by the words that she imagines him saying to her, "Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, come with me." And he repeats that, and again, that encloses that little bit of poetry between verses 10 and 13. So it's all artfully, beautifully, literarily done. And that invitation of his to her is at the heart of this passage. You can see it's pretty much slap bang in the center. So, in other words, spring has come, and he's trying to persuade her that the time for romance has come as well, that if the figs are ripening on the trees and the turtle doves are making their nests, then that means it's the season for love. Now, I suggested last week that some interpreters have said this sounds like a poetic marriage proposal. That's the way this passage is often taken. Essentially, he is asking for her hand in marriage. Others have suggested, well, no, actually, it's just a more general invitation to intimacy. And if we're to imagine the man and the woman married at this point, it's an invitation maybe to sexual intimacy, but it's couched in this poetic language. But what is clear is that it's an invitation of some sort to her. Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, come with me. He wants them to be together. But the path of true love, as we know all too well, never runs smooth. So we see in verse 15, catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards, our vineyards that are in bloom. Now, actually, it's not clear whether it's the man or the woman speaking here. At one level, it doesn't matter. What matters is this is being acknowledged as an issue, as a potential block to their intimacy, something that needs dealing with. So we see enough elsewhere in the Song of Songs to understand that the metaphor of vineyard refers to bodies, but particularly bodies understood in a sexual way. And that's the metaphor that's being used here, our vineyards that are in bloom. So whoever it is who's speaking here, it's a poetic way of saying, let's deal with anything that will spoil us enjoying the fruit of our, quote, vineyards. In other words, intimacy. Now, to come back for a moment to the work of John Gottman, he has famously written of the 4 horsemen of the marriage apocalypse. Now, as you might know, that's a reference to Revelation chapter 6, where 4 men and their horses, conquest, war, famine, and death, they're called out to wreak havoc on the earth. And John Gottman uses that image to talk about 4 horsemen, which will ruin marriages. And if we had time here, I'd love us, a little good exercise at this point would be to say, what do you think the 4 horsemen of the marriage apocalypse are? So I wonder if you could take a guess. You probably could, but I'll tell you at least what Gottman thinks they are. The 4 horsemen: criticism, not just a concern or a complaint of some sort, but attacks on your partner's character, he says. Defensiveness, failure to take responsibility for words or actions, so that we make excuses for our behavior or even shift blame to the other person. Stonewalling, emotionally withdrawing from your partner, disengaging, sulking, giving the silent treatment, so that what might have been a heated battle now becomes a cold war between husband and wife. Contempt, assuming moral superiority over your partner, which of course, can involve sneering or mocking or name calling or eye rolling, or just a sense of personal disgust in the other person. Now, just to be clear, you're not meant to be marking yourselves here and thinking, well, 2 out of 4 are bad. Just, but I think the point is when we're seeking to overcome separation of some sort, and again, for the sake of this evening, not just in romantic relationships or relationships between husbands and wives, but in relationships more broadly, and friendships more broadly, we can see how crucial it is not to give the four horsemen too much rein. Of course, it doesn't have to be a big thing in the context of a marriage. A fox might be any little thing that gnaws away at your enjoyment of each other. Unhealthy boundaries with friends or extended family, disorganization where schedule and household chores and budget are a source of constant frustration, pain from past hurts, poor health, financial pressure, job loss. It could be answering the phone during a meal, having screens at the table, not going to bed at the same time, not helping with the washing. And the foxes probably shift over the course of a relationship, but they're always going to be there. And it doesn't matter where you are in a relationship with your significant other, they're always going to be there. They're always going to need to be watched out for and dealt with. And they appear to be dealt with here when she eventually says in verse 16, "My beloved is mine and I am his," capturing the exclusivity and the reciprocity that comes with mutual love. And as we said last week, it's covenantal language there. Now, just before we move on, I'm going to pause for a moment. I'm going to read you something from a book by a guy called Greg Gutfield called The Scorecard, Keeping Score in the Relationship Games. This is a book written for men, enabling them to understand, he says, how points are scored in relationships in various scenarios in life. So I'll give you, he has a section devoted to navigating skills. So I'll share it with you. So you leave the house for a distant destination, claiming you know exactly how to get there. 0 points. Apparently, men, you get 0 points for that. 30 minutes later, you're lost, -4. An hour has passed and you're still lost, -8. You refuse to stop and ask directions, -10. And wherever you are, it doesn't look so safe, -15. You finally decide to pull over and ask directions, 0. Apparently, men get no points for that. That's the sort of thing that you should be doing. You meet the locals up close and personal, -20. She finds out you lied about having a black belt, -60. Then there's this one. A small fairy animal darts into the road and you do your best to avoid it, +4, okay? A small fairy animal darts into the road and you plow right over it, -5. And you cannot keep your inner satisfaction from bubbling over, -40. You wait a few weeks before scrubbing the bumper, -70. Well, there you go. There is wisdom. All truth, remember, is God's truth. So that's the daytime poem, and we're in no doubt about the man and his longing for intimacy with the woman. But does she feel the same about him? Well, the next poem, the nighttime poem, leaves us in no doubt that she does. I'm going to invite you, if you've got a Bible, to just have a look with me at chapter 3, verses 1 to 5. I don't have it on the screen, so you might want to follow along in your Bible. Now, in the daytime poem, it's the man who seeks her. In this one, it's she who seeks him. It's not entirely clear whether the woman is here dreaming about being separated from him, or whether she's experiencing a time of actual separation. He's not with her, and it could be both. It could be that he's not with her for whatever reason, and that then is playing on her mind. So it could be a dream, or if she's half dozing, maybe it's a daydream. Either way, she describes in these verses just a feeling of desperation. Now, you might recall that in the previous poem, the man is on the other side of the wall and he's peering through the lattice and so on and so forth. So he's there. But in this case, the man isn't even on the other side of the wall peering through a lattice. He's not there at all. He's painfully absent. But let's have a look at how it plays out. Verse 1. All night long on my bed, I looked for the one my heart loves. I looked for him, but did not find him. Now, the opening of the verse could be all night, as in all through the night, or it could be night after night. In other words, this is a recurring situation or a recurring dream. So night after night, she lies on her bed. As she lies on her bed, the woman has looked for her man, who she describes here as the one my heart loves. And you'll notice that repetition, I looked for, which just intensifies the fact that he's not there. Now, I know this is an unclear area, but if in some way our dreams do express something of our unconsciousness, then it may well that she is describing here just this recurring dream of losing him, not being with him, which seems, of course, more ominous at night, when for many of us, it's much easier for our imagination to run wild. And so she launches, and again, I suspect we're meant to imagine in her imagination or in her dream, she launches into a seek and find mission. Verse 2. I will get up now and go about the city, through its streets and squares. I will search for the one my heart loves. So I looked for him, but did not find him. So the field of her search is described as the city, the streets, and the squares. And I think the poetry allows us to imagine her hurrying along the street, turning into another one, running across the town square, into yet another street, searching as wildly as she can. Now, she'll give up, won't she? She'll eventually just head back to her bedroom. Well, not this woman, verse 3. The watchman found me as they made their rounds in the city. Have you seen the one my heart loves? There's a nice little use of the word found there, because she's looking for him, but not finding him. But she's found herself by the watchman. So it's a nice little irony, nice little wordplay going on there. And she's tumbling the words out here, literally, the one my heart loves, have you seen? That's the thrust of it. We don't even know whether the watchman know who the one her heart loves is, but that's what she's expressing. Do they say anything in reply? Well, we're not told. She moves on. Verse 4, scarcely had I passed them when I found the one my heart loves. I held him and would not let him go till I brought him to my mother's house, to the room of the one who conceived me. There's a shorter poem, but in the space of a few short verses, you can see a whole range of emotions, I hope, that are being expressed in the poetry. We've gone from a yearning to maybe a fear of abandonment, to panic-driven action, to just that rush of relief. So her quest to find him has been successful. And she says she holds on to him tightly and won't let him go. And she brings him home to Mum. Now, how romantic is that? It sounds strange to us, but it probably has to do with a custom of the time, that the mother's space, whether it was a room or a house or a tent, that the mother's space was the place for discussing and planning marriage. So in Genesis 24, for instance, Isaac is said to bring Rebekah into his mother's tent. And we have some kind of reference in the book of Ruth as well about Orpah and Ruth, and that, going back to their mother's tents and the like. So now, just as we had a kind of poetic hint in the previous poem that he's wanting to marry her, to be with her, this may also be a not too subtle hint on her part that she wants to get married and start a family of her own. So those are the resonances that we have here in about bringing him to her mother's house, the room of the one who conceived her. And of course, it reflects a different understanding of marriage from the one we're used to today. Again, this comes back to what we were saying earlier about our culture of individualism. So where marriage today, of course, can end up being about two individuals coming together, looking to each other to meet one another's physical and emotional needs. And of course, to some extent, that's right. But it can be, or it's just about the two of us. Whereas marriage in Scripture is much more than that. There is a context of community and family, which is highly significant. So we know right from the word go in the book of Genesis that there's a leaving and cleaving. There's a recognition there's a community and family recognition of what's going on, with the implication that the community and the family are involved in what's going on. I think we've already seen that ourselves in the Song of Songs, where the friends talk about, we delight in your love, and so on and so forth. And then this nighttime poem finishes in verse 5 with another admonition to the daughters of Jerusalem to be careful in matters of love. Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and by the does of the field, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires. Now maybe this is her way, again, of protecting herself from going any further, if we're to imagine the couple are married at this point. Perhaps she's offering good advice to her audience. She's telling them not to be untimely in matters of the heart or matters of sex or attempt to force love into relationships, especially considering its demands, especially considering its potential pain. Then here, as elsewhere in the book, there is a kind of delayed gratification. So once again, there's apartness as well as togetherness. But certainly this is a warning note that comes from a woman who knows that love is delightful, but also complicated. Now, last week we finished with this question: how do the daytime poem and the nighttime poem expose us to both the delightful beauty and the painful realities of love in the complicated world? That's a pretty long-winded question, I grant you. We didn't spend any time on that question, but I think it's an important and helpful one for us to reflect on. Here in this section, as I've suggested, we have these two poems, each describing the man and then the woman seeking. And once again, we see that although the poetry of Song of Songs does describe love in idyllic ways, it also reflects reality. There's a longing here for union, as in the daytime poem, but there's also loss too, as in the nighttime poem, even if that loss is overcome. If we were reading on in the Song of Songs, we would find in chapter 5 that the woman describes a similar experience, a similar dream. So the crisis is over, maybe, but don't assume there won't be a crisis again, or another crisis after that, or more pain after that, or separation and longing, and so on and so on. And I think we recognize the reality of that. This is love in the real world. Just as the longing appears to be satisfied and the lovers come together, they're driven apart again. And that's what love can be like, even in long-standing relationships. And I think it's important for us to be able to acknowledge that the path of true love never runs as smoothly as we would like it to. And in every relationship, even the very best of relationships, we have to allow for the pain of personal limitations, the pain of ill health, the pain of frustrated desires, the pain of unfulfilled ambitions, the pain of giving up on my own ideals for the sake of the other person. When married couples take their vows, they promise for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. And you don't take those vows unless you're anticipating that there might well be trouble along the way. So we tend to see those moments as bad or unwelcome. And of course, they certainly don't feel good. But pain gives an opportunity to grow in love. So as always, it's how we respond to those moments that matters, not the fact that those moments come. Now, as I say, there are a few moments in the Song of Songs where the woman fears, perhaps in a dream, that she's lost the man. She goes out looking for him. And so it's perhaps no surprise that towards the close of the book, we have a request from her for permanence in the relationship of love. There's a beautiful couple of verses in chapter 8, verses 6 and 7. Place me, this is the woman speaking, like a seal over your hearts, like a seal on your arm, for love is as strong as death. It's jealousy and yielding as the grave. It burns like blazing fire, like a mighty flame. Many waters cannot quench love. Rivers cannot sweep it away. If one were to give all the wealth of one's house for love, it would be utterly scorned. Very powerful imagery. The request to be a seal on the heart or the arm is really significant. As I think we all know, a seal was used as a stamp for making an imprint, and that carried the force of an official signature. And so to place a seal on something was to claim it as yours, to claim it as a possession. And so here's a request from her for the lover to claim her as his own. Also, seals were worn either on the hand or on a chain around the neck where they were easily accessible when they were needed. So the image may imply a kind of closeness. Place me as that seal over your heart. So in asking to be set as a seal on his heart or on his arm, she's asking again, as the book draws to a close, she's asking in a beautifully poetic and yet powerful way for a closeness and an intimacy with her lover. And love is compared to death. No one can conquer it. Love is stronger than any known power in human experience, stronger than death itself, he says. And just as death and the grave swallow men and women, so the passion of love, when it takes a person prisoner, will never let them go. And then love is compared to fire, like a mighty flame. That might be the only reference in the book to the name of the Lord. A flame of Yah, short for Yahweh, maybe, but it's uncertain. But in fact, unlike fire, she says, love cannot be quenched. Fire can be quenched, but not love. Love is of supreme value, she says. It can't compare to a person's wealth. Love is not, nor cannot be for sale. Again, just a beautiful recognition of the power of love. Now, of course, as we said in this series, Song of Songs may still lead us finally to reflect on our relationship with the Lord. From a whole Bible perspective, we can read the Song of Songs through the eyes of the covenant between God and his people. We're the bride of Christ. We look forward to the wedding supper of the Lamb and his bride. And so in some sense, the song does lead us to Christ. But I hope we've explored enough over the course of this series to suggest that we don't need to leapfrog too quickly from the Song of Songs in a rush to get to our relationship with Jesus, without seeking to do justice to this particular part of God's word in its own right, and by asking about its significance for us today. And I hope as we've had this short series that we've been able to do a little bit of that together.